We delivered justice to bin Laden a decade ago, and we've stayed in Afghanistan for a decade since. Since then, our reasons for remaining in Afghanistan have become increasingly unclear. It's time to end America's longest war. It's time for American troops to come home. The United States will begin our final withdrawal, begin it on May 1 of this year.
As the American troop withdrawal from Afghanistan is all but complete, the Afghan army is quickly losing ground throughout the country to the Taliban.
Taliban's been gaining territory across Afghanistan since international troops started pulling out.
What has happened is a lot of these district centers, which are effectively local government centers, are simply being handed over to the Taliban. The Afghan police or tribal forces, or in some cases, regular Afghan army, are walking away.
Afghanistan's President Ashraf Ghani has gone. He's left the country as Taliban leaders push for what they say is a peaceful transfer of power in Kabul.
Taliban forces entered the heart of the Afghan capital, Kabul, today, the culmination of a rapid advance and retaking of control almost exactly 2 decades after they were ousted from power. Fighters were filmed inside the presidential palace after Ashraf Ghani, now the former president, fled the country.
We'll not conduct a hasty rush to the exit. We'll do it responsibly, deliberately, and safely.
American helicopters busy over Kabul all day today, ferrying diplomats from the US Embassy to the airport. This disorderly end was not the plan.
The saddest part is that I didn't expect this, but now I might face consequences that I never even dreamed of. And I guess that's the price that we pay for trying to make this world a little better.
On Sunday, August 15th, the world woke up to the news that Afghanistan, known as the graveyard of empires, is once again under the control of the Taliban. The US and other allied nations have been withdrawing troops from Afghanistan since February 2020, and analysts had been predicting that the Taliban would probably take over at some point. But the speed at which it happened shocked just about everyone.
Well, everyone except the people who have actually been tracking what's been going on in Afghanistan. Like New York Times reporters Sarah Mukhtar and Rod Nordland.
On December 9th, 2019, the New York Times published an article titled, "What did the US get for $2 trillion in Afghanistan?" In that article, Sarah and Rod did not mince their words. According to them, the United States has very little to show for all the money and lives that have been lost in Afghanistan.
The Taliban still control over 70% of the country. Opium trade has resurged as the country's largest economic activity. At least 55% of Afghans still live in poverty. And the Afghan military forces cannot support themselves, as we've seen play out so spectacularly in the last couple of days. In this episode of The Backstory, we'll remind you why the United States got into Afghanistan in the first place, and how they found out, like the rest of us, that the Taliban is very much still a force to be reckoned with.
As you know, history is basically the story of one ideology trying to gain dominance over another ideology. After the Second World War ended in 1945, there was a period of time where the communist ideology, driven by the Soviet Union, was competing for dominance against the democratic ideology, driven by the US and the European countries. And Afghanistan, along with so many other countries, were caught in the middle of this fight.
In 1978, there was an attempt in Afghanistan to set up a communist regime that was obviously pro-Soviet Union. But when the people of Afghanistan pushed against this regime, the Soviets decided to invade and occupy Afghanistan starting in 1979.
The Americans and Europeans clearly didn't like having the Soviets being there, and they decided to support the Afghan fighters, the Mujahideens, to fight against the Soviets by providing them with small arms and light weapons. But even with this support, the years under Soviet occupation went by. 1980, 1981, 1982, until we get to 1987.
In 1987, the US gave the Mujahideens shoulder anti-aircraft missiles, and that completely changed the game. Now the Mujahideens were able to shoot down Soviet planes and helicopters, and they started doing so on a regular basis. Now, the people of the Soviet Union didn't like seeing pictures and videos of their planes being shot down from the sky. So they put pressure on their government, led by Mikhail Gorbachev, and Soviet troops started to pull out of Afghanistan in 1988.
It's estimated that the occupation cost the Soviets about $50 billion, which is $150 billion in today's value, and 15,000 deaths. By 1989, all Soviet troops were out of Afghanistan.
Now, every period of transition has chaos and turmoil built into it. It's the law of physics. And it was no different in the case of Afghanistan. When the Soviets left, new conflicts emerged primarily around social issues. Different factions competed for ideological dominance, but one of them eventually won out.
The Taliban.
The Taliban emerged as a conservative political Islamic movement that was able to create order out of chaos.
They provided security and they implemented Sharia law, Islamic law, which is what the people needed and wanted given the high levels of crime at the time.
Now, there were other conservative movements competing with the Taliban at the time, but the Taliban had the support of Pakistan and other foreign jihadists. With that support and under the leadership of Mullah Omar, they were able to control Kandahar in 1994 and then Kabul in 1996. By 1999, they controlled all of Afghanistan except for the northeast.
But during that time, they didn't really create a government of the people or for the people. The Taliban themselves do not represent all the people of Afghanistan because their members are mostly from the Pashtun tribe from the northern rural and mountainous part of the country. Their way of life, which is rural, is very different from Afghans who live in more urban centers, so they don't really understand that government is actually supposed to provide services.
In 1994, the Taliban had a vision for a way of life that they wanted to impose. This included no music, no games, no kite flying, and required men to keep beards and constantly pray. And they formed partnerships with other groups that shared a similar vision. It wouldn't be long, though, before one of these partnerships drew the attention of the United States.
Now, around 1996, the United States had its eye on developing a natural gas pipeline from Turkmenistan, and a good relationship with the Taliban would have helped advance that particular interest. So for the first few years of the Taliban gaining power, the US sort of just stood aside and observed. Some officials did start to get uncomfortable when the Taliban began imposing policies that stopped women from working, closed girls' schools, and required all women to wear the burqa, the covering from head to toe. But for the most part, the US government stayed neutral and out of Afghanistan's internal affairs. Until 1998.
Car bombs exploded outside the U.S. embassies in Nairobi and Dar es Salaam on the morning of August 7th.
On August 7th, 1998, two U.S. embassies, one in Kenya and the other in Tanzania, were bombed. 224 people died, including 12 Americans, and over 4,500 people were injured. The U.S. accused Osama bin Laden of masterminding the bombings. And in that same month, President Bill Clinton ordered cruise missiles launched against bin Laden's terrorist training camps in Afghanistan. At this point, the relationship between the Taliban and the United States was no longer neutral. It became hostile.
And over the next 2 years, the Taliban doubled down on their support for terrorist training and jihadi activities. They got bolder and bolder and continued to isolate themselves from the world community, including from other moderate Muslim states.
The Saudis even asked Mullah Omar, the leader of the Taliban, to extradite Osama bin Laden, and he outrightly refused. He even insulted Saudi Arabia, just for good measure.
In 1999, the United Nations designated Al-Qaeda as a terrorist organization and accused the Taliban of providing sanctuary for them. A UN resolution was passed that would sanction both Al-Qaeda and Taliban, cutting off their funding, travel, and arms shipments. Still, Mullah Omar refused to turn bin Laden over.
American 11, are you trying to call.
The cockpit is not answering their phone.
On September 11th, 2001, Al-Qaeda operatives struck New York and Washington, D.C. in a series of airline suicide attacks.
Came in like a missile, like a fireball missile across from the New York harbor side, I guess from the Newark direction. It came in like a spear. It just speared through the building like a fireball.
Oh my goodness. We're looking at a live picture from Washington, and there is smoke pouring out of the Pentagon. It would appear that there has been another
Americans were not only in pain that day, and in the days and the years to come, they were angry. They wanted and they needed something done. This time, the US threatened the Taliban with complete annihilation if they did not expel bin Laden and Al-Qaeda from Afghanistan.
Now, at this point, the Taliban didn't have any friends left. Even the Pakistanis were telling them to cut their losses and expel bin Laden before it became too late. But still, Mullah Omar refused to expel bin Laden and Al-Qaeda. He even threatened the US, saying that either they enter Afghanistan, which is also known as the graveyard of empires, they would suffer the same fate as Britain and the Soviets.
On September 18th, 2001, the US Congress gave George W. Bush free rein and a blank check to do whatever it takes to secure American lives and interests against Islamic terrorism.
And by October 7th,
on my orders, the United States military has begun strikes against Al-Qaeda terrorist training camps and military installations of the Taliban regime in Afghanistan. These carefully targeted actions are designed to disrupt the use of Afghanistan as a terrorist base of operations and to attack the military capability of the Taliban regime.
They started a bombing campaign against Taliban forces, and at the same time they supplied weapons to ground forces, which mostly consisted of local Afghan groups that were against the Taliban. The most prominent anti-Taliban group was called the Northern Alliance.
Despite Mullah Omar's graveyard of empires threat, the Taliban collapsed within a few weeks of the bombings and the ground campaigns, and by early November, they gave up their position in Kabul. By December 2001, it was being reported that Osama bin Laden had been chased out of Afghanistan and was hiding somewhere in Pakistan. It would be another 10 years before bin Laden was found and assassinated in Pakistan on May 1st, 2011.
With the collapse of the Taliban government, which wasn't really a government in the first place, the United Nations called for a resolution to set up a transition government. And in December, the Northern Alliance was set up as the interim government with Hamid Karzai as the head of that government.
At this point, less than a year into the mission, the first phase was over. The immediate threat, which was the training camps and the Al-Qaeda terrorists, had been removed. Yes, Osama bin Laden was hiding somewhere in Pakistan, but without his camps, he would be powerless. At least that was everyone's thinking at the time.
So then, the United States moved on to the next phase, which was to help stabilize the region to ensure that the terrorists did not come back and that the training camps could not be rebuilt.
In April 2002, the US President George W. Bush called for the rebuilding and reconstruction of Afghanistan as a post-war effort, sort of similar to the Marshall Plan which was implemented in Europe after the Second World War. Congress approved and appropriated over $38 billion to Afghanistan in humanitarian and reconstruction assistance to be spent between 2001 and 2009.
By 2003, the US military declared it was ending major combat in Kabul, and they were moving to stabilization and reconstruction activities, which would include training Afghan military and other security forces.
While military reconstruction efforts were going on, civilian reconstruction efforts were underway as well. In 2004, the interim government in Afghanistan worked with Afghan delegates to create a whole new constitution for the country.
And by the end of 2004, Afghans voted to elect their first president under the new constitutional system.
In 2005, Afghans held local elections. Over 6 million people voted, half of whom were women. And things kept moving along in Afghanistan while it kind of fell in the background for the rest of us. Every once in a while, something would happen over there that would remind us that the region wasn't completely stable yet. But for the most part, we just assumed Afghanistan was going through the growing pains that every new democracy has to go through.
Then somehow, somewhere along the way, the initial $38 billion the US Congress had appropriated has climbed to $2 trillion. Experts at the Watson Institute for International and Public Affairs at Brown University estimate that the total cost of war in Afghanistan from 2001 to 2021 will be over $2 trillion.
You could also look at it this way. America has spent more trying to keep the Taliban at bay than the net worths of Jeff Bezos, Elon Musk, Bill Gates, and the 30 richest billionaires in America all put together.
These estimates include the cost from the Department of Defense, the State Department, the cost of caring for veterans, and the interest on the amount the US borrowed for the war. And let's not forget that over 170,000 people died, including over 6,000 Americans.
With all that spending and loss of lives, you would think that what happened last week should not have happened.
Except it did happen, and it was bound to happen because the Taliban never actually went away.
In fact, in 2011, when the US war in Afghanistan had entered its second decade, the Obama administration was already looking for a way out. And to do that, they began peace talks with the Taliban. The fact that they had to negotiate with the Taliban directly and not the Afghan government should have been an indicator to anybody paying attention that the Taliban were very much still a force to be reckoned with. After all, you only negotiate with forces that matter.
Hey everyone, I have a couple of footnotes about this episode before I get to my closing comment. First, the episode is by no means an extensive review of the timeline that led up to what happened on Sunday. Instead, we really wanted to just focus on the events that led to why the US was in Afghanistan in the first place. Because we have a good number of listeners who are 35 years old or younger, and they may not remember or may not know about the events of 9/11. If you are looking for a more holistic timeline of all the events that came after 2002, we highly recommend the timeline that's on the Council on Foreign Relations website, and we'll provide a link to that in our episode notes. Second footnote. Afghanistan history is way beyond the Taliban, and Afghanistan has existed before the British, the Soviets, and the Americans. If you're interested in reading more about the country's history, there are a lot of books out there, and we will link to 2 of them in our episode notes. Third footnote. The Taliban is a political movement based on the strict conservative interpretation of Islam. They are not to be confused with Al-Qaeda, and they are not a terrorist organization. I know it's hard for a lot of us who grew up in liberal environments to wrap our minds around how people would want to live under a regime like the Taliban. But we have to accept the possibility and the reality that there are human beings out there, men and women, who want to and will choose that way of life. It's their right to choose that way of life, much like it's our right to reject that way of life. My last footnote is about U.S. interests. On Tuesday night, President Biden delivered remarks on the U.S. decision to leave Afghanistan, and he was clear that it was no longer in U.S. national interest to remain in Afghanistan. We're going to put a link to his video in our episode notes. Now, I can imagine that a lot of young people are struggling to understand what U.S. interest means, and there are a lot of comments out there about the U.S. being selfish. And every time comments like that get made, the first question that I have is, well, why isn't your country selfish? Why isn't your country and why aren't your leaders focused singularly on your country's interests above all else? Now, there is a fine line between protecting U.S. interests and burning bridges, and I do fear that the way this particular episode played out may have burned a bridge, particularly with the young people of Afghanistan. And we may see the repercussions of that in about 20 years. Okay, on to my closing comment. As most of you know, on this podcast, we focus mostly on Nigerian headlines, but I felt the need to discuss this issue of Afghanistan First, because it's a significant global event and it will have global repercussions. And second, because I think that there's a lesson that Nigeria can take from this. In Nigeria, we are constantly trying to balance between tribes and religions. But what's happening in Afghanistan is a lesson that there is a larger equation that needs balancing. And that's between the rural population and the urban population. Now, the Buhari administration has actually been trying to balance the rural versus urban equation, especially with policies around agriculture. But there's so much more that needs to be done in terms of rural access to education, healthcare, and civic engagement. The kidnappings and all the other unrest that we've been witnessing in the country is a signal that the equation between rural and urban is not balanced. And if the next administration loses focus on continuing the efforts to balance the rural and urban equation, then kidnappings are going to be the least of our problems. The Backstory is brought to you by E Media Productions. Production copyright 2021 E Media Productions. If you enjoyed this episode of The Backstory and want to hear more, subscribe to our 234 Audio YouTube channel. Episodes of this podcast and our other podcasts can also be found on our website, 234audio.com, as well as Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, TuneIn Radio, Spotify, and wherever you get your podcasts. This episode of The Backstory was produced by Richard Anyebe, John Iwodi, Alexandra Gekpe, Dominic Tabakaji, and Sam Tabakaji. Executive producer Rahmat Muhammad. Special thanks to Rabia Hadejia and Gbado Ikaleku. If you are interested in sponsoring this program, reach out to us at 0818-230-1234 or email us at info@234audio.com. I'm Rahmat Muhammad. See you next week.